Antarctica, Peru, Egypt, are these ancient sites all connected? There are many theories, cases as well, but the evidence is too much to ignore and abandon as non-existent and without logic. So let's see then what main things and indications led to the conclusion of how Peru and Egypt are connected to each other, but also to Antarctica. Fleming and De Ath, known as Flemath, have evidence that a shift in the Earth's crust, 91,600 BC, pushed Europe into the Arctic Circle, while another one, 50,600 BC, shifted America to the polar zone. So Europe was in the Arctic, pushed to the Arctic, and America to the polar zone. All the evidence shows that present-day Antarctica is located on the site of legendary Atlantis. They also cite Charles Hapgood cartographic evidence to strengthen their position. A movement of the Earth's crust that began 11,500 BC, ended in violent turmoil 9,600 BC, at a time when, according to Plato, Atlantis and Athens were hit by catastrophic disasters. Not only that, it must have been the whole world, obviously. A series of natural disasters, including terrible floods in the Nile Valley, put an end to the agricultural revolution around 10,500 BC. And we remember that's 12,800 years ago. That's just about the time of the, yes, you got it, the Younger Dryas comet impact. That put an end to the Clovis culture in North America, megafauna, megaflora disappearing, almost a world extinction event. Kindly support my Patreon account since YouTube has again demonetized my YouTube channel. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below. So this was 10,500 BC, the year in which West speculates that the destruction of Atlantis took place and the survivors came to Egypt and built the first version of the Sphinx. This is also this, well, look, the Giza pyramid we know from the Emerald tablets. Thoth says he was the one that was to be credited for building this plateau. Thoth the Atlantean. So, some Atlanteans escaped, and he said, according to the Emerald tablets, went to various places in the world, and the first thing they did was build pyramid plateaus and start up their cultures again there. So, the year in which West speculates the destruction of Atlantis took place, survivors came to Egypt to build their first version of the pyramids and the Sphinx. This is the chronology in which, according to Boal, the first Egyptians designed and probably began to build the pyramids of Giza. It's also the date when, according to Nature in 1971 and New Scientist in 1972, the last reversals of the poles took place. All this shows that the date when the white gods, quote-unquote, came from east to Mexico was 10,500 BC, the Younger Dryas impact and all this that was going on. If this is also true of the tradition that Viracosta founded the sacred city of Teotihuacan based on factual facts, then Teotihuacan was at least designed at the same time as the pyramids of Giza, and any knowledge embedded in its geometry layout was transmitted from one culture to another. Now, the spider and Orion. We know that the Egyptians considered Sirius and the constellation Orion, in the heel of which Sirius is, particularly important. We also know about Abbot Brazer. He was convinced that Sirius was the sacred star of the Mayans. Quote, we have reason to believe that the spider of the Nazca Plain, the Nazca lines, the spider of the Nazca Plain represents the constellation of Orion, which was just as important to the Egyptians, end quote. According to astronomer Phyllis Pitluga, in the form of the spider is a diagram of the constellation Orion and its movements over the centuries. Quote, as coincidences like these continue to accumulate, it is becoming increasingly difficult to avoid the conclusion that the cultures of North Africa and Central and South America and a common origin, and that this common origin, they had a common origin, that this common origin has roots so deep in the past that only our hope for understanding lies in the decipherment of the dim, almost invisible signs that they left behind. Let us also remember that the only time the positions of the three pyramids on the ground reflect the arrangement of the three stars in the Orion zone is 10,500 BC. A landmark date, since the Egyptians named this era Zep Tepi, first hour, and identified it with a kind of golden age, the beginning of a new era. Now, what about immigration of these peoples? In his book, The Earth's Shift, Charles Hapgood claims that Antarctica was 4,000 miles, or 4,000 kilometers, I don't know, 4,000 something, closer to the equator in 15,000 BC, and if so, then it's easy to imagine that the displacement of the continent was an incredible disaster for those who lived there, and was probably accompanied by terrible floods. The evidence gathered suggests that the survivors of this mobile continent sought refuge in South America and Egypt, and we saw that the natives of Central and South America named them Viracosta. If all this has a basis, then a group of these Viracostas migrated to Egypt, discovered that this sheltered country with the great river and the annual floods was an ideal new homeland, and they began to create a new culture there. Now, how Antarctica has become identified with Atlantis. So far, we have seen the most important commonalities that connect Central and South America with Egypt, also that they are related to Atlantis. All that remains is to identify the legendary island with Antarctica, according to the various theories formed by Flavio Barbiero, Charles Berlitz, Eric von Daniken, Peter Colosimo, Charles Hapgood, Rand Flem-Ath. A common background for most is the map of the Piri Reis showing Antarctica without ice. However, we choose a different but very good approach based on the Argonauts and Timaeus, the ancient Argonauts of Greece, Jason and the Argonauts. You can find a movie of that. I think they just put it on Netflix. And also Timaeus, what Solon told Platon concerning the destruction and the various past destructions of Earth. Now, in order to be able to follow the reasoning, we must take into account, according to the above, that we are in an era where we have a reversal of the poles, that is, then the north and south were the opposite. Based on the current positions, the Argonauts were heading south to the land of fire, and from there, and within 10 days, it covered about 1,200 kilometers. That's around 120 kilometers a day, which is not too much, which separated them from Antarctica, where they arrived. At this time of the Argonaut campaign, Antarctica seems to be inhabited by at least two tribes, that are the Macrobes and the Cimmerians, who lived. And the Cimmerians lived in the center of Antarctica, where the Acheron River flowed to the underworld, Hades, and that the Cimmerians collected the tolls for the passage there. Now, at this point, we'll make a description of Antarctica. And we'll see that in the middle there is a large bay, and the edge is a vaginal cape, seen nearly clearly in the maps of Google, which has a characteristic shape, sharpened sword cape Antara, and a kind of figure of ancient Greeks is the Hieroides sensus, the sacrum of Coccyx, the same spine because of the shape. And attention to details are to watch in comfort the ancient texts that will that the ancient writer uses the argot, the spaceship that the Argonauts had, to give the direction to flow and not to say that the ship was talking. The reason why it does this is probably related to the ancient mysteries in the text. Now, if not, move parallel to the shape promontory formed between the inside of the land, which is the bay, and that is, they do not fish there, the sea. Then they will quickly find ourselves outside the Atlantic Sea, which is their direction since they go to the Irish Islands. And as can be seen, if they do not follow the curve of the Cape, they will actually be far from the region of Oceania. So the ship knew what it was saying. The ship was a talking ship, as we know. The Argo was able to even read their minds. The minds of the, what should we call them? The noble, elite kings and princes of the Argonauts. They made up the crew of the Argonauts. Now, then in following a sea course of 12 days with a strong wind pushing them from this, and now after the sign of their increase in speed, about 100 kilometers a day, we see that they have reached the island of Dimitra, which is probably the island of Auckland, a small island now, since the level of the sea is now 300 feet higher than it was at that time, over 100 meters. So from there, by right as well, needs a circular motion arriving to New Zealand. That's the island of Kirki. You know, the woman that turned the Argonauts into swine in the Ulysses and the Odyssey. Now, they pass in between the two islands, as shown on the map, the columns of Heraklion, and stop to the right at the Cape of Dionysius, which, due to its shape, has two long parallel almost sides, which is why the text is given the word bisexual to declare that these two long coastlines extreme forth against Dionysius retrieves Nemonem. So I don't know what exactly that, I can't translate that, but anyway. Here, Argonauts or Phaeus, why we got as much information as we could. The area called Oceania, the Atlantic, the Pillars of Hercules, Tartesio. Now let us turn to Plato and Timaeus. From the outside, they rushed to the Atlantic Sea. He said, "Do you see where I'm telling you? It's these have been orally had been far dilated as yet. Hercules columns in the island upon Libya and Asia Major, on price passengers islands, but the islands of the Katankitri passage continent about the true point." I don't understand what it says here. So whatever we say in our mouths, it seems like a narrow port. What the sea really has, or the sea that contained it, or the land that contained it, absolutely right if it was called a continent. Now they came rushing out. The sea rushed out because then the sea there was navigable from an island that had in front of the mouth, which, as they say, is called Heraklion columns. That is the gates of Gibraltar, and the island was bigger than Libya and Asia Minor Asia together, from which you could walk to the other islands, and from these islands to the opposite big continent that stretched for a long time in that real ocean. Why in them? What in the mouth to him do we say? It seems there is a port with a narrow entrance to that sea, and the land that surrounds it can right be called a continent. So does anyone have any doubts about where Atlantis is? And if all of the above seems a bit too much, consider what a great continent it once was. I've translated this for you from a Greek document. Please leave your comments, and thank you for your support.